Hello and welcome to Founders Amplified, where we spotlight underrepresented founders who are driving innovation and impact across various industries and sectors across the globe. I'm your host, Narayan Kulkarni, and I'm excited to be here with you today. Today's guest is Helena Traill. Helena is the founder and creative director of New Studio. Originally from Surrey and now based in Bristol, UK, Helena identifies as a young female founder with ADHD. She holds a degree in graphic communication design from Central St. Martin's and a master's in healthcare and design from the Royal College of Art. Her creative co-design agency, New Studio, works with healthcare organizations and communities to tell powerful stories through human-centered design. She is also the author of The Ideas Machine, a weekly blog about building a business around a creative, neurodivergent brain and finding new ways to fuel your own creative practice. Helena's work has been recognized through campaigns for London NHS trusts and talks at Imperial College, Central St. Martin's, and UAL. So, now that you know a little bit about Helena, let's dive in to the conversation. Welcome to Founders Amplified, Helena. It is great to have you with us. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. Nice and warm in the UK.
Glad to hear that. It's also nice and warm here in the US. And yeah, thanks again for joining us. So now to kick things off, I'd love to know a little bit more about your journey. So can you tell me what led you to become a founder and if there was any particular moment or experience that sparked that decision?
So, I am the founder of a design agency called New Studio. I'm a graphic designer by trade. And just say thank you for having me. I'm neurodivergent and I hope to stay on track. So, let's see how this goes. I started my business or became a founder about 4 to 5 years ago. And I remember the exact day that happened, that I launched my business as a limited company. And it was because I was working with a client, quite a high profile client, and they had a bigger design agency. And at this time, I was freelance. And that client, to cut a long story short, that agency tried to poach my client. And I realized that as a young female in the sector I was in, I needed to look bigger and better. And so I launched as a limited company the next day and became a founder. It started as Helena Traill Design, and then a few years later became New Studio. And I think quite a lot of that was around my confidence of having that kind of bigger, more exciting studio name, which I was pleased I did about 2 years ago now.
Well, thanks for sharing. I appreciate hearing how you got started. Literally like the next day. So it sounds like it was a very like quick but also like a very like affirming and exciting decision in certain ways. Now I'd love to learn a little bit, dive a little bit deeper into like aspects of your story and how that informs it. So can you tell me about, are there any particular aspects of your identity? So for example, being neurodivergent, being a woman, being in the UK, or any parts of your story, like being a creative or anything else that you feel give you a unique perspective in what you do at New Studio?
So I think probably the key one is being neurodivergent. So I'm ADHD, autistic, also known as ADHD. And that I think affects my everyday as a person, but also as a founder. There's a stat that in the UK, about half of creatives are neurodivergent. And so that's not just myself as a founder, but also how I work with creatives and other people that work around me in my team. And so that's been a lot of learning. And as my coach, one of my business coaches have said, it's like business untangling. And so how I've untangled my own brain and then how I communicate that to others. So that's been a lot of kind of daily work, but I feel like that's getting there. And then the other parts are definitely, well, when I started, as kind of mentioned, that agency that poached one of my clients being young and female. I know that's not supposed to happen in 2025, but I do believe that when I started and I was less confident, I'd walk into a room which in the agency and world is predominantly male and kind of middle-aged, just to annoyingly have to put a label on it. But when I'd go to networking events, sometimes I felt that I wasn't even allowed in a circle and it was, oh, who's she? And actually, as I started to build a profile, I then wore my networking trousers, as my team calls it, and kind of power clothes and went for it. And so, suppose had to learn how to put on a bit of a facade to be as confident as other people in the room.
Thanks for sharing. I appreciate you mentioning that. So, two things you shared which really stood out. So, first of all, I did not know about half of all creatives being neurodivergent in the UK. That is a really, really big statistic. I hope that our audience is listening, like pays attention to that because, of course, that's really important. Of course, the like neurodivergent communities is really, really important, and there's so much need and innovation that needs to be done, but also amazing innovators like you in your own way doing things. But at the same time, like sometimes people may not understand, like within like the creative sector, that's really important. The other thing which you mentioned, which I also appreciate you mentioning, was yeah, the dominant people in a particular sector can be of a specific identity, and that can be very, very off-putting and have a like create a lack of confidence. But at the same time, it can be a a prompt for one to have self-awareness and like really think about how one shows up strategically. So for example, I talked about this in episode 0. I know, for example, like I have connected with, spoken to other people who are people of color, also female founders, as example, other people who are neurodivergent, who they're conscious of kind of like some of the challenges that they face in being in rooms where people are not like them or rooms that were not designed for them, and then having to like navigate those in a thoughtful way, but still being able to show that courage and resilience to then like go forward in their own way and have their own like idiosyncrasies. When you said networking trousers, I thought of like that's like an idiosyncrasy where like it works. So I appreciate that you shared that aspect as well. So on the point of uniqueness, so I think every single founder has a unique spin on what they do. New Studio is obviously a very unique design agency. And so, can you tell us more about what is unique about what you do at New Studio, or like how you just engage with clients, or like the types of projects that you design that might make people think about like any of that differently, or that might just make them turn heads?
Yeah, let's try. So, we say that we're a social impact design agency that specializes in co-design. So, co-design is, I like to think of it as collaborative design. It's co-production, which is quite a buzzword, definitely here in the UK, especially with charities, and social impact. And so, what we do is when we're designing a brand or a campaign, we bring the audience for that brand or campaign on the design journey with us. So, one of the kind of bigger examples of the last few years was we built a brand for young people by young people for the Co-op Foundation, which is a big charity here in the UK.
I'm aware of the Co-op Foundation.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And we built that brand, the Young Game Changers Fund. It was also with the National Lottery and I Will Fund, and with a group of young people because it was for them. And so we did a series of design sprints across 4 weeks. I like to say that I brought art school to the co-op because it's very kind of big thinking and design thinking, and it was really fast paced. And we worked with about 15 young people through a series of 1 hour co-design sprints and brought together the brand. And my favorite stat of it was that at the end, the brand got signed off within 24 hours across 5 of those major organizations, which apparently has never happened before. But I don't take credit for it, or Nu doesn't take credit for it, because it was that group of young people that we built it with. It all had justification, it all had this kind of super strong identity and reasoning and meaning behind it, built for that audience by that audience. So you couldn't really argue.
Interesting. And thanks for sharing. But yeah, like 5 clients within 24 hours. That I will
It
say,
was
like
pretty good.
for many founders, like in any industry, that's pretty insane. Or even for like seeking investment or getting 5 yeses is quite something. But something which you mentioned, so I appreciate hearing more about co-design. And so, I mean, many of our audience may or may not be as familiar with some nuance. So I'm just going to ask you what for you is probably going to be a very simple like thing, but hopefully for our audience will be illuminating. Can you tell us more about the difference between co-design and user-centered design, and how do you go ahead and like in your way, like how do you in news work honor that distinction?
Mm, that's a good question. So, user-centered design, or as I like to call it, human-centered design, is all about taking, and I'm sure taking the user's journey, mapping it out, and then designing for that journey. And so, a lot of founders, I've worked with lots of different founders over the years from startups, who will say, okay, we're building an app for this user. And so we take that user journey and build the app with that journey in mind. And ideally, you might have multiple users. And so to get a little bit geeky, there's this bell curve that's known as the extreme user bell curve, which is that when you're designing as user centered, you'll probably take the middle. I'm trying to no one's going to actually see my finger doing that, but you take the middle of that bell curve because you're saying, right, we're going to build for the average user, especially if you're building hard and fast, right, as a startup. And so you miss off either side of that, the extreme users, which for an app, someone might be not technologically able, are you then designing for someone who is hard of sight and might not, might need a screen reader, etc. And so co-design, where am I going with this? Co-design is then designing with all of those users and hopefully with some of those extreme users as well through that design process. So you're not just taking the user journey and then designing for it, you're doing it with them, which with user-centered design, you hope you're doing anyway. I think the other important differentiation is that a level above co-design, you have co-production. So co-production would be across the whole thing, and really co-design is a section of that you're designing with that audience. So the gold standard would be co-production, and if you want to learn more about that, then there's an amazing charity-based uh, organization in the UK called the Co-Production Collective, and they have an amazing blog and resources around co-production, co-design, etc.
Sounds good. So if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like co-production is the most inclusive and the most participative for the client. Co-design is further narrow than that, and then user-centered design is even more narrow than that. If I'm understanding correctly in
Yeah, I think
practice.
user-centered design is like seen as like a general piece, but I think you've really got to think about how you co-produce within that methodology.
Gotcha. And in your view, why is it important for people who are in so for clients of yours that are working in social impact, clients of yours who are from underrepresented groups, so say people who are also identify as female, neurodivergent, etc. Why is it important for them to have co-design in like co-design like services like what you offer?
I think the underrepresented groups is the banner, right? It's the point that you go to that group and you understand what they're thinking and their experience. And so, if I'm designing for a neurodivergent female founder, my view is one of many, one of thousands globally. And so, how do you then go to different people within that experience? I even think of it as a founder of, say, someone that's trying to raise if you're going to create a pitch deck, lots of different people, lots of different users effectively are going to see that, right? You're going to have maybe VCs, funds, different people seeing it. Well, how do you then co-design your pitch deck like with the people that are going to see it? And how do you get their feedback and how do you iterate to improve on it? I don't know, maybe a different way of thinking about it.
Interesting. Great point. And then, of course, in each of these steps, of course, empathy become is a really important part. Really honoring their lived experience and how they feel in how they're using the product. How do you go ahead and through your work at New honor that aspect of what they're doing?
So my favorite, I love that you bring up empathy because not everyone, sees it as part of human-centered design, or they see it as part of human-centered design, but not immediately. And my favorite thing is empathy mapping. So if you were mapping a journey of a user, you map, okay, they do A, then they do B, then they do C. But how do you map the empathy and their experience on top of that? So you might say at point A, they're upset and annoyed because this happened. So for me, the key of empathy mapping and thinking about the user is stories. So when you're co-designing, if you're creating a campaign, whatever you're designing, what's the story behind the person and what they're thinking? What might they say that when they were doing A as part of their user journey, what were they feeling, what were they thinking? And so you start to build up a picture. So if you can layer the user journey, that kind of human-centered design, the touch points with the tech or the service, but then also the empathy and their story on top of that, then you create the biggest picture you can to then design something really good.
Cool. Very cool. Thanks for sharing. Can you share a little bit more, if you're able to, any clients that you have worked with? Of course, you can like anonymize them, but like, can you tell us, walk our users, not our users, our audience through how you like engage with like an example client and what the results were for them based on their partnership with you, and how
Oh, it's a
that was
good
probably
one.
unique relative to other like agencies they might have worked with.
Yeah. Well, I think the co-design piece levels up the output. Like I'm obviously going to say that, but it's super hard, design-wise. How do you quantify something? Annoyingly, it's not like we have clicks on a website where you can say we had less bounce back or 2.5 times more views. But people have raised since working with us, they've raised as founders. We also trying to think what in terms of engagement. So an example would be last year we worked with NHS London on a big internal comms campaign. And that was all the design was actually backed by behavior change. So it was all around how this piece of design was going to change behaviors for clinicians within the NHS. And 6 months later, those behaviors did change, and that was part of the communications toolkit that we produced.
Okay, very cool.
Still
It's
pretty
cool.
vague. It's annoying. Design is vague sometimes.
And I appreciate you mentioned this point about vagueness or difficulty quantifying what or measuring what's there, because I feel, and especially in entrepreneurship, for example, there is, and in healthcare, which is where like I've like started my work experience. There's a lot of emphasis on tangible outcomes, and that's true, but the intangibles are really important. Also, there's a lot of emphasis on outcome metrics versus there are, of course, things like process and structure metrics that enable them, and also impact metrics that come after that, which I think are oftentimes neglected. And as to the question I asked earlier, empathy, I think, and how a user feels or how someone feels in the system, both the people who are delivering the service as well as people who are like beneficiaries, I think that perspective is often neglected, and that can really shape the interaction, which is why it's important. And I appreciate your angle on this and your thoughts on this. Now, I think my next question, kind of zooming out. So, with the work, I'm sure you've done a lot of really cool work with New Studio. You've given like the example with the NHS, which is really cool. In let's zoom out to like 5 years, 10 years. What are the impacts that you're seeing in the world that show that what you're doing at New Studio is working?
Oh, well, I'd hope that co-design is going to be used more. And you're starting to see that actually within the UK with charities specifically, they're putting that into their briefs. So whether that's New Studio or whether that's a bigger picture thing and people like the Co-Production Collective are doing, is how does co-design and co-production become a standard practice? How do you see human-centered design at the core of a brief or, of different founders and what they're doing? And so that I would hope is standard, that no one's going to ask me in 10 years to design a brand. They're going to say, can we co-design a brand? And at the moment, that's tricky with funding. When you're co-designing, you're spending a lot more time, and so how does that become a standard? So I think that's my number one, fingers crossed. And then storytelling, how do we tell more stories through our communication? Again, it's slowly bubbling. The work we do with the NHS, they're asking a lot more for 3 to 5 minute videos on stories and case studies of improved services. And so, how do I have clients hopefully coming and saying, "Can you tell this story?" And having, yeah, bigger budgets to be able to do that in a nicer way.
Mm, well said. One thing that stood out from what you shared was it sounds I'm hearing this as a structural thing and a culture change in terms of how people are thinking about like co-design as an instinctive aspect of a way of working, as well as of course more funding, more visibility, more like into the structure of how work is done um, is there. So I appreciate your angle on both of those.
And
Because
I
yeah,
hope
like
I'm
again,
still doing it. Just to say, I hope I'm still doing it as a studio, and I really enjoy what I do. So keep going.
yeah, and of course, like one hopes that, and like even in like we have a world of AI, we have like lots of different things happening, but like to your point, whether or not one continues working in a particular like specialty, or like if they've like since grown or like pivoted or whatever there may be, an impact can still be there. And I appreciate your angle on like what that could be. It could be like, okay, one is like pioneering that impact, like super, super in the front for like all the time for 5, 10 plus years, or they're just like playing like an ecosystem more like background role, or they're just like create like in the butterfly, like just like the single flap of the wings for the butterfly that then creates the hurricane. It could in any one of those roles there is an impact, and I appreciate again your angle on your perspective on what that might look like for a new studio. Now I'm curious. So it looks like you've had a. It sounds like you've had a lot of adventures, if you want to use that word, in co-designing with different clients. Can you tell me, it's a two-part question, what is one thing you've learned about being a founder that you wish you'd known before you started? What's one another thing that you've learned about co-designing wish you'd known before you started?
Oh, that's so hard. One thing I wish I'd known as a founder, uh, people skills. That's very broad, but I've never had a boss, so I've only ever literally gone from uni to being a founder, with a very short in between. And so when I've heard other founders say, "Oh, I'm so glad I did that 10-year corporate sprint," and well, not sprint, that's a long time, but worked within a business and then become a founder, I didn't quite understand why that would have been so useful when I started. Because having to catch up on people's skills, I call it learning tax. So it's the fact that as a founder, I always have made mistakes and have had to learn things fast, on the go. And so definitely the piece around people skills. And then co-design, trust. You mentioned empathy. How do you ensure that you've got trust, whether it's with a client, with the people you're designing with, how to build that trust right from the beginning and then carry that through? Because a lot of the time I'm working with charities a lot of the time, and when you're say rebranding a charity, people don't like change. And so how do you ensure that you're building that trust like from the first second before you've even got there? Because you're working with people very closely, and hearing their stories, and it's something very personal.
Well said. Thanks for perspective. Now, how can people find you and how can they support your work?
Thanks. You can find me on Substack under the Ideas Machine. So I think I've written now 50 blogs for the last year. So I write every Friday. I've just had a short hiatus, but that's actually for creative leaders. So perfect for any founders in the creative industry. Or you'll find me on LinkedIn, Helena Traill.
Cool. So thanks for sharing. And to our audience, you'll see Helena's information in the show notes. And yeah, to your point, Helena, yes, we do have founders listening to this podcast, as well as other people who are like friends of founders and other community members miscellaneously. So yes, like we do have a pretty diverse audience where for you, I'm sure they would find something interesting. As for each of our guests, there might be something interesting that they will find and like ways in which they could learn from, support you. So thank you for sharing your Substack as well as your links. Now it's time for our signature question. Can you please fill in the blank? I amplify.
I amplify. I should have prepped this, shouldn't I? It's like the key question. I I amplify youth voices through co-design.
That's very, very profound. Also very,
That's
very,
yeah.
yeah, very profound. Also very, very, like, I'm just reflecting on our conversation. And yes, like very amazing things you shared. And again, thanks so much for sharing and being on the podcast. Helena, it was really cool to hear your perspectives on co-design, hear what you're doing with a new studio, and like understand some of the impacts that it'll be making. And again, I want to step back and reflect further. So first of all, I applaud you for being a leader in your own way, and inspiration to underrepresented founders in your own way. But also, I think from our conversations, a few things that I received, which I want to celebrate, are so to your point about. I didn't know this. Hopefully, our audience will also know this. I think something you brought, which I think is really important, is understanding the um, prevalence and the importance of being neurodivergent in general, but also particularly in the creative industry. I appreciate your perspective on that, which I think is really, really important. You talked about in the UK context, but also we have a global audience. So like hopefully our global audience will see that. The other thing which you mentioned, I appreciate you picked this up from me, was you've talked about the aspect of really intentional collaboration where there's trust and process. And I think both of those elements need to be like discussed at a high level. And I appreciate that you highlighted both of those, because whenever I've connected with collaborated with people who are like in the design industry, and they're ultra process heavy, and they're ultra like design heavy with like the aesthetics of the design, but they don't always think about like empathy and bring that enough, which I appreciate. And finally, to your point about and again, like a lot of people who I've like connected with who are like designers, they focus a lot on like apps and like corporate and things like that. But you, as you've talked about, you are really intentionally focusing on like social impact, like in the charity sector in the UK with the NHS. So I applaud you for also in your way using your skills in a way that is really going to enhance what like social impact groups are doing. So thank you for in those ways doing the cool things that you're doing. And of course, being someone who like, and I think it's really important to have people who are neurodivergent being in leadership roles and really bringing their experience and their uniqueness into that role. So I appreciate you for being all of
Oh,
those in what you do.
well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. And so I look forward to staying in touch, but as it's the end of our episode, I'd like to say bye for now. So I look forward to like hearing from you again, but bye for now, Helena.
Bye for now. Thank you.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Founders Amplified. I hope you're feeling as inspired as I am. If you'd like to learn more about our guest and support them, check out the show notes for their details. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating, share it with someone you know, and follow us for more inspiring episodes like this one. If you're a founder who is driving innovation and impact in any industry or sector anywhere in the world and would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Check out the show notes for more information. And finally, remember that you, yes, you, have the power to amplify the voices around you. Whether you're a colleague, family member, friend, funder, mentor, or just another fellow human, your support matters. So I invite you to celebrate and uplift the underrepresented innovators in your life who are driving innovation and impact. Let's create a better future for everyone, together. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep amplifying.